But as you know, our first part of the program is a conversation between Bruce Schneier and Edward Snowden. Bruce is one of the world's leading experts on computer society who we've been extremely fortunate to have visiting here at Harvard as a fellow at the Berkman Center for the Internet and Society for the past year and a half. One thing that's really remarkable about Bruce is the extremely wide span of the kind of work he does. It ranges from mathematical research papers on the design and analysis of cryptographic algorithms to policy engagement by serving on government committees and testifying before Congress, and a huge amount of writing about computer security for lay audience through popular articles, blog posts, and a number of books, the latest of which is Data and Goliath, the new book that is coming out, I believe, on March 2nd. And Bruce will be having a conversation with Edward Snowden, who probably needs no introduction. But Edward is a former intelligence officer who served at the CIA, NSA, and DIA as an expert on technology and cybersecurity for nearly a decade. Before the disclosure of classified documents in 2013, while he was a consultant at the NSA. Last year, EPIC, the Electronic Privacy Information Center, gave Edward one of its Champions of Freedom Awards for the effect of what he did on transforming the public debate on privacy. And we're really thrilled that he could join us today for this conversation by video conference with Bruce Schneier to talk about surveillance and tools for addressing that.
I'm pretty sure that applause is for you, not for me. Well, welcome to Harvard.
It's good to see you again, Bruce. Thank you very much. And I'd like to thank you and Harvard and the Berkman Center, everybody involved, for the opportunity to speak. I have to say, the Berkman Center, from my perspective, during my time with the NSA and everything, long before 2013, has always been kind of on the leading edge of these topics and issues and thinking sort of ahead of the curve on the debate. So I just want to say thanks for everything they've been doing, and I hope they continue in the future.
Yeah, thank you. So well, let's start by talking about cryptography and what can and can't be done. I mean, to me, the biggest surprise in all the NSA documents is the lack of big surprises. That we don't see any major secret sauce of quantum computers or, anything that says they, or really any intelligence agency, can do magical things. And to me, that's really interesting.
Right. I would say it's critical and it's important because it reminds us that despite all of the documentation we've seen, all of that outcome of the revelations, and everyone's been concerned, is that encryption really is one of the few things, the mathematics of it, when it's properly implemented, that we can rely on. And this is fundamental when we talk about computer security because we've got to have some foundation. We've got to have some basis for trust from which we can start building things. And when we look at the software, typically this is not reliable. But when we look at the stories that have come out and been reported publicly about how the NSA attacks encryption, properly implemented encryption does work. The algorithms and the math are often sound. And when they do attack it, it's typically through some kind of weakness, some sort of shortcut that sort of reduces the resistance, but typically not a clean break. There's no magic key that unlocks crypto.
Yeah,
they're more likely to do is try to go around it and steal the keys off of the endpoints.
Right. So there was something in the black budget. It was Clapper's introduction, and he has an interesting sentence, and I always talk about this. He says, "We are investing in groundbreaking cryptanalytic capabilities to defeat adversarial cryptography and exploit internet traffic." So that's an interesting quote. I mean, it doesn't sound like we're hiring a bunch of mathematicians and hoping they get lucky. It sounds like, right, we got something in the back room. We got the massive computer. We got the cool piece of math. Is that just a PR sentence and trying to make whatever congressmen and staffers read that optimistic? My question is, I'm thinking about this. So do they have like a break on RC4, or is this a massive database of SSL keys, or is it something against some amateur stuff?
So I'm not going to reveal anything that has yet to be published. I leave it to the journalists to decide where to draw the line in terms of what should be public and what would basically cause more harm than it would cause benefit, because I have a strong political bias. And by trusting these decisions to the institutions of the press, they can sort of remove that bias and make a more reliable decision. So I don't want to get too ahead of them there. But what I will say is that when you think about government culture, yes, there is some showmanship to the way they write this. These black budget documents are typically the results of budget justification. They go around and they ask all the offices, what are your successes? What are the things you can do? What are the things you're working on that we can pitch to get more money? And this is how ultimately we end up with the $75 billion a year intelligence expenditure that we have now. But when we look at the actual cryptographic accessing methods that have been typically pursued, yes, there are some successes. There is a lot of success against homebrewed crypto, sort of boutique crypto, commercial closed source crypto, and critically hardware implementations of crypto. But when we talk about the real academic open source peer-reviewed standards, things like AES, Blowfish, Twofish, things like that, those are typically pretty robust, pretty reliable, and we have seen within the documentation references that indicate that there are certain cryptographic methods that are widely deployed today.
We saw this in some of the documents that Spiegel released in December, that OTR, PGP, that these are Tor, that these are open security cryptographic standards that are giving the NSA a lot of trouble. So we are learning that. Interesting, the black budget, it's hard to check the numbers, but it seems to me it's 35,000 people and 11 billion are part of what are called the Consolidated Cryptologic Program. That's DoD-wide. About 4% of that goes to research and technology. That's 440 million. So there's a lot of money being spent on the math. And I think it's a credit to the math that this much money, this much effort, whether it's the NSA or China or any other country, isn't producing these fantastic results. 10, 20 years ago, we would assume that we in the academic world were a decade behind the NSA and other countries. And it seems that that might not be true, that there is more parity than we thought.
I do think the community is much closer to the NSA's understanding of the math today than they have in the past. Crypto was, kind of a black art, along with computer security, for decades and decades. Recently, we have seen the sort of capability gap, as we consider it, and this is around the world, not just within the U.S. community, really shrink. It's come closer together. But this mathematical expenditure, it is valuable, and it does have a payoff in certain respects. One of the keys are sometimes governments use their own algorithms. For example, the Russian government has their own encryption algorithm standards for protecting their classified data. So when we talk about things that are publicly used, these are really dangerous. And honestly, if NSA has some capability against it, they should not be using it. They should be reporting it and closing it, because it actually weakens us, the United States, and the public internationally around the world if we have poor security. But if they're using this against sort of, again, boutique crypto that's only used in sort of adversary contexts, this is something that they should be investing heavily in researching. When they do have successes there, they should exploit that.
I've heard this period after these documents called the second dark age of cryptography. Because again, we have a lot of people suddenly not trusting anything building homebrew stuff, which is inherently more vulnerable, just like we saw in the mid-90s when we didn't know anything and people are inventing their own crypto systems. So, but yeah, so what you said is what I think we're learning is that the way, again, not just the NSA, way everybody gets around cryptography is by getting around the cryptography. One of the documents that Spiegel published talked about VPNs, right? Several of them did. PPTP is a VPN standard. It's insecure. I mean, I wrote a paper that broke it, I think, 1998. And here it is still being used. And of course, it's being exploited. I mean, not just by the NSA, probably by everybody. So we do see a lot of these commercial systems that are poorly designed being exploited, either by whoever.
Right, and one of the other big distinguishers is the fact that we're not talking about laboratory environments. We're not talking about sort of the academic implementation. We're talking about practical implementations that work at scale. For VPN exploitation, we're talking about automation of it, the detection of it, the ingestion of it from the front-end collection systems, pulling it back sort of to our storage systems where we can keep it forever, and the automation of using sort of a gigantic resource pool if it requires some kind of cryptanalysis to do that in a standardized way where you don't have to have an individual human going in and doing all of this. It simply just happens in the background 24/7 while the lights are off. And it provides them access into sort of our private lives, private records. And this has intelligence value, but also has significant risks to sort of the fabric of the internet and the infrastructure. Now, at the same time, we shouldn't be relying on these old bad standards that we know are weak. Also with encryption, one of the things that we've seen is, given this sort of dark age mentality that you've mentioned, there are really two risks. One is that the algorithm itself could be weak, a weakness that we are not currently aware of. Also, the implementation could be bad. When we get new crypto tools, it normally takes a number of years before we know they're robust, before we know they're reliable. They have to be reviewed by a number of people, they have to be broken a number of times, and they have to be fixed. And eventually they reach a level where they're sort of defensible. For algorithms, we don't have that same standard typically, because there's not that many people who can attack them in a credible way outside of the academic community, which is quite small, which is why when we get new crypto, we don't see it adopted for 10 years. What I wonder is if there's any way we could sort of pull this curve forward by doing research into cascading cryptographic algorithms, where we don't rely on a single implementation, a single algorithm at a single bit length, but actually use 2 or 3 or an arbitrary number of different cryptographic algorithms that are performance aware and sort of provide us that.
You'll see that sometimes, right? In general, the algorithm is the strongest piece. I mean, this is what we're learning. So whether here we are building a wall, and now we're arguing whether one post should be a mile tall or a mile and a half tall. In a sense, it doesn't matter. What we really have to worry about is the rest of everything. So the bad implementations, the weak keys, any kind of backdoors that can be inserted in the software. And we're seeing a lot of that. I don't know if you remember, there was a backdoor found. It wasn't inserted, but almost was, into Linux a few years ago. We don't know who did it. It showed up in the code. It almost got in. Now, it could have been any government. So that is a much bigger risk. I was reading last night some of the documentation on the surveillance arms manufacturers, the companies like Hacking Team, RCS, that are sold to third world countries, that do much the same things that the NSA does, not at the scale, but it is hacking into a computer, reading the encrypted traffic after it's been decrypted, keyloggers grabbing passwords. And I'm reading what these capabilities are, and it's very much the same as the NSA toolkit, presumably the Chinese government toolkit. And we're seeing this democratization of these techniques. What countries have that I think, what the major countries have, is the budgets to do the parallelization. Like what you said, doing it automatically 24/7 based on privileged positions on the internet. Right? The Chinese can do that just because of the way their internet works within their country. Russia is trying to get the same capability. The NSA has a lot, simply because so much traffic goes through the United States. And that's something else you said early on, that it's the endpoints that are weak, that it's not the data in transit that's weak, it's the endpoints which then can break the data in transit. Sort of interesting to see that interplay.
Right. Ultimately, it comes down to the level of effort that the adversary wants to expend. When you're thinking of it from the offensive side, when I'm going after a target, you look at the target and you go, how can I get them? Now, the reason we see this explosion in mass surveillance that we've had in the last 15 years of the post 9/11 era is because passive is cheap. It's easy. It's simple. If you're a nation state, as you said, whether you're China or France or US or Russia, whatever, if you can go to the telecom providers, and there's a lot of plain text out there, just pull it off the lines, and there you have it. You've won. Sort of, you got the communications, you've got the associations, you've got the content, you've got whatever you need on the lines. Now, the benefit of encryption across the wire is that it makes that much more difficult. They have to either go with a much more sophisticated attack, they have to subvert the certificate authorities, they have to go after the key material, basically. And one of you kind of hinted at this earlier, one of the real dangers of the current security model at scale for defenders is aggregation of key material. If you have a centralized database of keys, that is a massive target. They'll go after that either remotely, or they will send someone to get hired into your organization to develop access and eventually exfiltrate that key material. Because again, they don't want to attack the crypto. They don't want to expend computational resources. They want to just be able to unlock it by getting around it. As you said, the wall is high, so rather than go over it, they'd rather dig a hole under it or walk around it. We've got to focus on the endpoints. We've got to focus on the keys and how to control it. Basically, more defensible.
I mean, and something else is happening in the United States, at least, is we have these legal attempts to get keys. So we saw the whole LavaBit example,
Compulsion.
Compulsion, where the FBI went to the LavaBit, went to the courts and said, "Give us the master key." We saw this with Skype, which is something we didn't know for a few years. We knew that Microsoft did something to Skype to make it more eavesdropping friendly. We didn't know what. And there was a document in the latest Spiegel release that talked about it, that they redesigned the system so that they had the keys, and now the US government can go with a FISA warrant and demand access to the keys for whatever Skype traffic they wanted. And reading the NSA document looks like they got broad access to Skype, the audio and the text. And presumably, other countries can do the same thing with the companies that they have that legal compulsion.
Yes, and we do see that. We see that happening increasingly around the world, and it happens on both a discriminate and an indiscriminate basis. Obviously, we want to err on the side of discriminate, targeted compulsion whenever that happens. But intelligence authorities in general, they have sort of three methods for going after these systems they don't like. They've got coercion, they've got compulsion, and they've got intrusion.
Now, they also have bribery, right? We know that they'll occasionally pay.
Well, I kind of count that in coercion. But
okay, fair enough.
But that's exactly it. I mean, subversion being what they did with NIST, the standards organizations, where they will sort of abuse the trust that the industry, the commercial sector, the academic sector has in them, in their brand, the idea that they're called the National Security Agency. So we assume they're going to secure our communications without necessarily being aware that they have this dual role, this dual mission. And in the last decade plus, they have really shifted their focus. They're a much less defensive organization than they've ever been before. And a much larger, a much higher portion of their efforts is committed to offense. So really, if the NSA is knocking on your door and asking for your help, if it's not on a compelled basis, where there's some kind of court involvement, you should really be asking yourself, why? Is this proper? Is this appropriate? And does this serve the public's needs broadly? Am I sort of benefiting an intelligence agency, a group of spies, a state security bureau, or am I benefiting the public, the country, the government? And these are really questions that we need to think deeply about.
You know, actually, I want to get back to that later. But so I want to sort of talking more about this way of collecting the data. Again, I think the surprise from the NSA documents is there's not a lot of magic. So when I was working with The Guardian in October and released the story about Tor, the big thing that The Guardian and the NSA were negotiating and they didn't want released was quantum, the quantum program, which is basically packet injection. And what surprised me is how that's not a big secret. Right?
Well,
right?
the technique, I mean, yes, you can do this in Starbucks.
Well, you see it everywhere. I mean, there are hacker tools that do packet injection. The Great Firewall of China works on packet injection. Both Finfisher and hacking teams sell packet injection to pretty much any third world country who wants. And a lot of the techniques are very democratic. Foxacid, the big NSA system that does exploiting individual computers, looks like Metasploit. Right? It's another hacking tool. Yes, it has a bigger budget, probably a better user interface, certainly better tech support, but these aren't major differences. So I think we have to start looking at a world where these capabilities are everywhere. I mean, it's what you're saying. It's attack versus defense. But these defenses affect everybody because these attack tools are very, very common.
They are common, and the difference, again, is scale, it's reach, it's complexity, and it's resourcing. And it's also how they're applied and how we expect them to be applied. When hackers are doing this, we socially recognize that this is not a public good. If it's security researchers doing it to demonstrate a vulnerability, that's one thing. But otherwise, this is a criminal act. We were not aware that these agencies broadly were involved in criminal activities. And they were. I mean, these still are, in many cases, criminal activities. There is no explicit legal authorization for these programs, many of these programs, even on the target basis, to occur in this way. They could be. There's nothing that said they could be prohibited. But if we live, in a constitutional society where we have a government with specific enumerated powers, and there's no authorizing legislation that says, hey, you can hack these people by impersonating private companies, such as LinkedIn or the FBI sending Reuters stories to somebody that aren't actually from Reuters or the AP, whoever it was. That's a significant departure. And the government agencies, both domestically and abroad, were aware of this. In fact, in the GCHQ, we saw that in their own internal classified documents, they said they weren't concerned about these capabilities being revealed because it would provide some kind of real security risk or it would reduce their capabilities. It was because they were afraid of a, quote, damaging public debate. They were afraid of the fact that if we knew about this, it would enable legal challenges that might change and restrain the way they operate.
Well, let's talk about this. I think this is interesting. It's the notion of risk. Now, one of the differences between passively listening on a wire and collecting the data and going into the adversary's computer and either grabbing traffic before it's encrypted or changing router tables so traffic moves to where you can intercept it. Any of these more active penetrating techniques, is there a higher risk? Right? You have more risk of getting caught, more risk of getting noticed. Now, depending on who you are, whether you're a criminal, whether you're a country, whether you're a major power, your appetite for risk is going to change. It'll depend on who your target is, depending on who you are. And one of the things I noticed early on reading some of the documents is how risk-averse the NSA was. I was reading the manual for Foxacid, and it felt like it was a manual designed to take an unskilled soldier and turn him into a cyber warrior. And it was full of, if this happens, stop. If it looks weird, stop. If there's a problem, stop. If there's an infinitesimal chance of you getting caught, stop. Stop, stop, stop. Compare that to, let's say, a cyber criminal organization operating out of, someplace in Southeast Asia is going to have far fewer stop conditions. Right? They'll go and they'll try because maybe they'll get lucky and there's not a lot of risk.
Right. So when you look at it from the offensive standpoint, right? When I'm sitting at my desk at the NSA using these operations, or I'm a chief in one of these offices directing these things, again, the biggest thing is the fear of liability. They realize that some of these things, again, are not explicitly authorized, and so they've got to be careful not to have these things exposed. They don't want it to be revealed, and when you're using passive operations, you're not leaving log entries. It's not going to follow you home. As you said, when you switch to active operations, suddenly you're leaving evidence. You're leaving something that could come back to haunt you someday. And again, the Der Spiegel stories recently, they showed that the NSA will intentionally try to make itself look less capable when it hacks somebody to go, oh, this couldn't be the NSA. These guys don't know what they're doing. And they would use sort of cutouts. They would use third countries to exfiltrate the data. So they hack country A, send the data from country A to country B, so they think country B hacked them, and then they send it home through their sort of exfiltration route back to us. There is a big risk aversion there as well in how the personnel is managed, as you said, sort of the checklists they go through. People have this mental conception of TAO, the NSA's hacker, the tailored access operations, and they're ROCs, as they call them, or remote operation centers. And they think these operators, these guys are sort of these you know, the mythical hackers on steroids guys. These guys are like, you know, amazing. But the majority of them, well, not necessarily the majority of them, but a great proportion of them are junior enlisted military guys. They don't have, you know, particular training on this that's exceptional. They've gone through a couple weeks of training. Really, it's a paint by numbers operation. And the reason they have so many stop conditions is, as you say, it's to limit liability, that somebody who may be clever, but also may not be so clever, leaves something behind. They get a little froggy, they go a little beyond their skills, and they make a mistake. Now, obviously, there's different levels of capability, different levels of skill for each individual person. But by constricting this, bureaucratizing it, they can minimize their sort of political risks, their public risks. And that is, that's reasonable in a lot of ways, and that's why they do it. Now, something that we've seen, though, is over the last, you know, again, in sort of this terrorism era, the war on terror period, that level of hunger for risk has greatly increased. They've been hacking everybody as we've moved on through the decade, until sort of 2013, and then because everything blew up in their faces, they've sort of backed off a little bit, I think. But while they do have these policies in place to try to mitigate the risks, I think it's wrong to say that they're risk averse contemporaneously, because we see the targets they're picking in a lot of cases are crazy, they're unjustified. I mean, the GCHQ, for example, the sort of British NSA, was just revealed by The Guardian a few days ago to have intercepted and stored the emails from journalists from the New York Times, from BBC. They knew they had journalists' emails, but they kept them anyway. Why? You know, these are things that shouldn't be happening, and if they were truly risk averse, they wouldn't be doing this, because they know it's unlawful, they lack the authority to do so, but they did it.
Well, I mean, there's a couple of things. One of the things I'm trying to contrast what I see the NSA and GCHQ doing is some of the attacks coming out of China. I mean, looking at the past decade or more of Chinese military attacks against the United States, against government networks, against defense contractors, it's surprising how sloppy a lot of those attacks were. It's surprising how risky they were. And there are some China watchers that talk about the relationship between the attackers and the government, that they're not necessarily employees, they're free actors who just know if they find something good to pass it on to their handlers. And I think we found, I mean, I think there's some increasing sophistication in cyber attacks around the world, as, in a sense, this is becoming normalized.
Right. The body of knowledge is increasing as well. I mean, again, not everybody knew how to do this. It wasn't a paint-by-numbers thing. As you have more people going through these organizations, as you have the level of academic knowledge improving, as you have sort of the tools, techniques, you know, developing and improving and increasing in sophistication, that sort of bleeds out. It expands and covers a larger body of people, a larger body of actors. And you have more people involved, more actors, more noticed activity, more exceptional actors who are never noticed because they're never caught, but also people who are not very good and are caught regularly. The other thing is, again, the difference in culture, in liability. I actually worked against the Chinese target when I was in Hawaii, I would say. So I know quite a bit about this, and I can't talk at full liberties here. But in general, the level of sophistication in Chinese cyber units is not great. I mean, there are people in this room who probably were much more capable than a Chinese military cyber unit when they were teenagers. But again, the difference is when you're a military unit paying military wages, selecting from military rosters, you've only got a certain level of talent. You've only got a certain level of skill. Some of the other actors are people who are moonlighting. You know, they may be working in an intelligence organization, they may be working in a military unit. And again, they realize that as they've worked there, their skills have developed, and they're not being compensated relative to sort of their product. So they go home at night, they continue hacking, they aggregate information, they exfiltrate it, and then they sell it.
And then sort of on the other end, you have almost the script kiddies of national intelligence, right? The companies that are buying the Finfisher. And I think of Uzbekistan or Ethiopia or Syria. We will see these countries using them to target dissidents and journalists. So again, the same tools that these bigger countries are using, much sloppier, I'm sure easier to detect. I'm sure, with not a lot of skill. And then we have the Monk School up in Toronto finding a lot of these attack tools on computers, on phones of people around the world. So we are seeing this huge array of risk averseness. I seem to think the United States is changing. I was reading some of the Reagan stuff when that came out last fall. It was surprising of the array of targets that the United States was targeting with this tool. A very sophisticated attack tool, and similar in scope to some of the Russian, the Chinese, the other tools that the antivirus companies expose off and on. I think since it surprises me that as risk averse as the NSA was, there really never was a plan for one copy of everything we've ever written being published. That was sort of a scenario that was beyond the scope of risk planning. And I would think that now, the NSA, GCHQ, is going to have to look at every one of their programs and say, this is probably going to become public in 5 years. Do we think that's okay? And that will cause a change.
Right, and we've already seen that happen. I mean, we've seen that happen at the highest levels of government. The president himself said that the way they go about looking at which operations to authorize and which ones they're going to pass on has completely changed, based on the principle of just because we can do it doesn't mean we should. And this is wise, because the thing is, when you have organizations like the NSA, which are basically completely free from any meaningful oversight, they have sort of hand-wavy oversight. They've got compliance officers. But the Washington Post reported that they had more than 2,776 privacy violations in a single year. And these are only the ones that are self-reported by the NSA. These are the only ones that are detected, that employees say, hey, I did this, it was wrong, it was a mistake. The majority of people who are doing the auditing are the friends of the analysts. They work in the same office. They're not full-time auditors. They're guys who have sort of other duties as assigned additional job role. There are a few traveling auditors and things like that who go around and they look at the things that are out there. But really, it's not robust. Beyond that, they're regulated by a secret court, which is a rubber stamp. I can't remember the exact figures, but it's something like they were asked 31,000 times or something like that for warrants over the last 10, 15 years. And they said no, I think 13 times?
I think it's some small number.
Right.
It's some small number like
fraction.
that. Well, I mean, that could be just really good warrant writers.
9% of the time, they say yes. They say do whatever you want, it's fine. So this is the challenge. When you're operating in this environment, a culture of impunity develops where the people working in NSA, they're not bad people. You know, these aren't villains. They're not trying to end the world. They're trying to do a good thing. But they go, I can do this, I can do that, I can do anything because it's for a just cause. And the challenge is when you take the political oversight out of it, when you take the judicial oversight, and again, meaningful judicial oversight, not sort of a fake surveillance panel, but a real court with real judges, as opposed to FISA judges, you get a really different quality of decision. And this has a significant impact on the kind of decisions that are made. And I do think things have changed significantly. For the people in the audience who weren't familiar, you mentioned Reagan earlier, the Reagan operation. That was it's called Operation Socialist. The United Kingdom, their NSA, the GCHQ, decided to hack into the Belgian state telecommunications provider that's used by everybody in the country, rather than seeking access through the MLAB, the Mutual Legal Aid Treaty between those countries, because they didn't want the Belgians to know about it. They basically damaged critical infrastructure, caused millions of dollars of harm to these systems, which, by the way, still hasn't been fixed, according to employees there, using NSA capabilities. So you get this weird chain now, where the NSA is sharing infrastructure, they're sharing capabilities with third parties, with foreign countries, basically. They're then using our tool sets to hack other foreign countries with which we are allied, with which we have friendly relations. We have no idea. We can't really think ahead and figure out how this is going to work out in the end because there's no model for it. It hasn't happened before.
Well, I mean, there's two different kinds of oversight. I mean, one is the tactical. I mean, I think that the NSA is very good at tactical oversight. That are we doing things right? Are we following the rules? And that's what we saw in those self-reporting privacy violations. We broke our rules. We made a mistake. That's very different than, are these the right rules? And that's a form of oversight, but it's not oversight that can happen inside the organization. It has to happen at a greater level. I mean, are we doing the right things? Right? Not, is this legal by the rules we have agreed to, that have been given to us, the interpretations of the laws that we've made, but is this the correct thing that we as a country should do? And that's a very different kind of question. And the way you get that greater oversight is through these discussions of what makes sense. I mean, what is moral in our society? What is proper? Just because we can doesn't mean we should. Or maybe it does.
There's a big question there about, is the potential intelligence that we gain worth the potential costs? A good example of this is the fact, this is sort of a picture of what the NSA considers industrial relations to be. That's a Cisco box there for anybody who can't see it in the audience. They're intercepting sort of American products and services, whether it's Facebook, whether it's Google, whether it's a Cisco physical router, and they're subverting them. They're weakening the security of them. In some cases, like this case, they're implanting Trojans and sort of malware, where they're going at the hardware level. They're putting firmware modifications, BIOS modifications in there, that are reducing the trust in the security of American products. And this is critical in American infrastructure because it has a real cost, not just for us morally, not just for us legally, not just ethically, but financially. I mean, the American technical sector is critical to the future economic health of the country. And we've had studies done since the 2013 revelations that have shown the NSA's activities, just the ones that have been revealed so far, have cost us somewhere between $35 billion and $185 billion. I mean, that's more than their budget in harm as a relation to just poorly thought out operations that never should have been done in the first place. There are, again, methods that they could do this lawfully, legally, and with the public's knowledge and consent, where we don't have to go, yes, it's okay, hack that particular individual, yes, hack that particular government or organization, or whatever, but we should at least have a reasonable understanding of the broad outlines of policies and powers that they're investing themselves with. If it's happening behind closed doors, they can't really be said to be representing our interests because they are divorced from our interests. when there's no communication, they're no longer part of the community.
Well, I mean, then that Cisco story, I think, is real interesting to see the implant going into the box. And we certainly worry about Chinese implants coming in equipment that bought there and brought into this country. Sort of interesting to see, very generally, all of this government surveillance is fueled by corporations. I mean, it's not that the NSA woke up one morning and said, we want to spy on the entire internet. They woke up one morning and said, corporations are spying on the entire internet. Let's get ourselves a copy. And whether it's getting a copy by putting an implant in a Cisco router, or by going into Google's trunk links between their data centers, or going to Microsoft Skype with a court order and demanding a key. I mean, this is all data that is sloshing around the corporate world. We've built an internet for surveillance. We've decided that advertising, that marketing, that personal information is the currency by which we all buy our internet. And that fuels what countries can do. And again, not just the US, it's everybody. Everybody's using all of these platforms. So to me, it's interesting to see now that these NSA stories are public, which I think are also shining lights on what other countries are doing, what criminals are doing, the democratization of all of these techniques, sort of showing how insecure everybody is. I think we're seeing changing attitudes in some cases in the standards bodies and in some of the tech companies. The IETF, in an engineering task force, is trying to build more security into the internet. We're seeing Google encrypting trunk leaks. I mean, it's Google. So, at one point they're saying, and it's always amusing to see when they complain about the government spying on their users because it's their job to spy on their users. But we are seeing this change. So maybe there is some hope for technology to make this better.
There is a little bit of rethinking going on there, and I mean it's a complicated issue. There's a lot of debate to be had there. I don't even think we've started at a significant level on sort of the corporate surveillance issue yet.
I think we've lost you. You're back.
Sorry.
You're back.
Right. So state actors broadly around the world have been piggybacking on sort of this aggregation of data that's happening in sort of all these different corporate silos around the world. And that siloing, that aggregation, those centers of gravity, they're simply too rich, too interesting for governments to ignore. And that's a danger. We need to think about how to do this. And this is where decentralized models are interesting. Right now, the current sort of business model of the internet is, as you said, we're exchanging our private records, the value of those for access to some sort of service. And this has happened in ways that are both knowing. For example, the Google model, where we opt in, generally we're saying, yeah, I'll get this Gmail account, I'll put all my email on your server, so of course you have access to it. But also other ways we're not so aware of. I've been reading your book, Data and Goliath, and in the intro to it, you mention sort of cell phone networks. It's a sort of brief introduction for non-technical people, and it just explains that if you have a cell phone in your pocket, you're, without being aware of it necessarily, agreeing to allow the cell phone provider to know your location wherever you are all the time, because that's how calls are routed. It's sort of a byproduct of the service. But it's a real question of, does it have to be that way? And of course, we know it doesn't now, at least on broad terms. That's sort of an artifact of the way that architecture developed. But we have decentralized routing models now. We have proxies for identity. We can use cryptographic tokens or hashes to represent an individual. We could have transient tokenization, and we've got all these blockchains and different methods of tracking and recording interactions with complex systems that could substitute for the traditional models we have. The real question is, where do we go with this? Where do we draw the lines? And this is what the 2013 revelations changed, is before it, there was no cost to collaboration at the expense of the users, because nobody knew just how badly they were getting sold down the river.
Yeah.
After 2013, we saw immediately Apple, Google, Facebook, basically everybody who showed up on the PRISM slides. They said, everybody whose logo is at the top of that slide right there. Suddenly they, whoa, maybe we should change this. Yes, we'll cooperate with the government, but you've got to come in through the front door. At the very least, you have to use normal legal process. You have to use a warrant. You have to show probable cause that there is a requirement for this data. You can't just do what you've been doing and hack into a Google backend, sort of those trunk links you discussed and things like that. That's a significantly positive development and a big change. And I think there's more to come on that front.
It may be interesting to see. There has been over the decades a lot of research in privacy-preserving technologies, in ways to do, possibly cell phone, being able to deliver calls to cell phones without keeping a database of where every phone is, and having a cell phone being a tracking device. Ways to do electronic transfer that are anonymous. We've had digital cash protocols since the 80s. Of course, there's been no appetite for it. Right? There's been no appetite because companies want that data. They want it for marketing, and now governments are piggybacking on it. So it'll be interesting to see if we can rebuild some of these systems with less metadata. One of the things we haven't talked about is how much of this information can't easily be encrypted. A lot of what, not just the NSA, but what everyone does is use this data to collect association graphs. It doesn't matter what we're talking about. What matters is that you and I are conversing. And who you converse with, who I converse with, right? This is the whole metadata conversation. This is the multiple hops. And that data isn't easily encrypted. The network needs it, at least the way it's built today. And I think one of the open questions is, can we build a more privacy-preserving network? Can we do better than that?
Right, and I think one way for sort of the technical audience here to think about how do you conceptualize this metadata, this encrypted issue, encrypted content issue, is even if I, for example, am doing sort of a counter-cyber investigation, I'm trying to attribute an attack, and I can't see the content because the content's using some kind of sophisticated exploit kit that encrypts all of its exfiltration, all of its exfiltrated data, but I have the accesses to install, basically a tiny equivalent of Wireshark, and then just do a packet capture on all of the traffic on a given system. I can see what it's communicating with. I can look at the volumes, and I can go, this is user data, this is user activity, and this is anomalous activity. And then, even though I don't know what it is, I can go, well, it's going to this hop out here. That's clearly, one step in their exfiltration chain, their operational relay box, as we call it in vernacular. And then you go to that one, you do the same thing, you hack that box, you capture its traffic, and this is assuming you don't have passive. If you've got passive collection in the background, you don't even need to do this part. You can then hack the next box. Go, who is it talking to? And even if you can't read the content the whole way home, eventually you can follow it home. And eventually the encryption drops off because it's at the end point. Even if that chain is 100 links long, if you keep at it, you'll get there eventually. And we've seen increasingly that sort of the arguments for mass surveillance that the governments have had aren't really reliable. They're not really meaningful. They've said, this is to stop terrorism, but we know it doesn't stop terrorism. The PCLOB, the Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board, the president appointed this, the White House appointed this. It was packed with, former CIA deputy directors and things like that. People who have every incentive to say, these programs are great, we want them, they're wonderful, said they had never stopped a single terrorist attack. And this is a broad contrast to what the NSA originally put forth, was that it thwarted 54 plots. And then later, the Senate questioned them a little more carefully on it, Leahy, I believe it was, and they said, no, in fact, it wasn't 54 plots, no, they weren't attacks, they weren't anything like that. It wasn't even 54, in fact, it was one guy, a cab driver in California, sending a couple $1,000s to his clan in Somalia.
So there's actually a really good New Yorker article appeared either last week or the week before talking all about that case. It's a really interesting case.
Right, it's the Moylan case.
Right, yeah. Worth reading. So we're close to out of time. I want to sort of end with one issue that I think pulls us all together, and that's the equities issue. The notion that the NSA has to balance two different focuses, defend our networks and attack their networks. And those missions, I think, made a lot more sense during the Cold War, when you could defend the US radios and attack the Soviet radios because the radios were different. There was us and them, and we used different stuff. What's changed since then is that we're all using the same stuff. Right? Everyone uses TCP/IP, Microsoft Word, Firefox, Windows computers, Cisco routers. We're all using the same stuff. And whenever you have a technique to attack their stuff, you are necessarily leaving our stuff vulnerable. Right? And conversely, whenever you fix our stuff, you are fixing their stuff. Right? And this requires a different way of thinking about security versus surveillance, a different way of balancing, that we can't simultaneously do both. And when we look at all of the attack tools out there, the vulnerabilities are great. And every time we hoard a zero-day, hoard a vulnerability, we're leaving ourselves open to attack from anybody.
Absolutely. And the way to conceptualize this is to think about when you launch an attack, you're not stealing a sort of a fixed amount of points, cyber points from the enemy, research data, intelligence data, whatever. It's really a percentage based on the size of their investment, the size of their economy, the size of their R&D funding. If we hack the Chinese, and the Chinese have sort of 100 cyber points to be had, that attack is worth 10% of the points. We got 10 points. But if we have, 1 million points, and they hack us once because we weakened the standard, it doesn't matter if we hacked them, all 10 times, or took all 100 of their cyber points. If they hack us once because we weakened that common standard, they're far, far ahead because they have 100,000 points, even though we got the 100 points. And that's really something that we have to deal with.
And this is our problem with hacking back to North Korea. They have what, a dozen computers. It makes it a lot harder.
The Spiegel story actually drew this out in a large way that was not really noticed. The significance of it was not noticed. And this was that we had compromised their networks, according to the NSA documentation. Since 2010, we had been hacking North Korea successfully. And yet, it didn't provide us a lot of detail, didn't provide us a lot of information. We missed missile launches, we missed nuclear tests, we missed leadership changes, we missed health issues, we missed military drills. And we even missed the Sony attacks that they launched. Even though we were hacking them, we were eating their lunch over and over and over again over the course of years. But then they hack us once, just one time with Sony. And everyone in the nation is rending their garments and going, this is terrible. They're attacking our basic values, because it was so much more valuable to them to win once than it was for us to win 1,000 times. And this is something that has to stop. I could add one point just for people to think about, because a common trope, sort of a meme that we see government officials around the world now advocating to sort of defend mass surveillance, besides the fact that they say it stops terrorism. We know it. Whether it's Paris or London or Boston or Mumbai, none of the mass surveillance programs stopped any of these attacks. They say encryption, right? They say we've got to ban encryption, we've got to mandate backdoors, we've got to have a way in. Everybody has to collaborate. They have to give us some way to access your encrypted data, or we're going to go dark. We're not going to be able to continue to investigate. Murderers are going to walk free. Our children are going to be violated. All these terrible things happen. Pay attention to the Silk Road case that's going on right now, sort of the Tor online drug market that was shut down. The accused, Ross Ulbricht, allegedly the mastermind behind sort of this whole Silk Road affair, used PGP, which we know from their own documents they could not break. He had fully, irresistibly encrypted material, and yet, just yesterday in court, they were reading out his encrypted diary entries to a room full of reporters. Why is that? It's because, as you said, encryption is not foolproof. The endpoint is a weakness. And if the user can at any point ever view that encrypted material, it is vulnerable to the adversary to seize that without any new authorities.
Well, we could probably keep going for another 4 hours, but I think everyone else will get mad. Thank you very much for being here. And and hopefully we could bring you back in person next time. Thank you. Thank you.